He lost his titles. He lost Royal Lodge. He lost the protection that comes with being a senior royal. And now, according to a string of sensational reports, Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor wants something in return. Money. Not a modest relocation package, not a nice bungalow and a Waitrose loyalty card. The figure being whispered is £75 million. And that may not be the most extraordinary part. Other reports claim Andrew has hinted that if the king refuses to support him, he could begin talking about sensitive matters inside the royal family. In plain English, pay the bills, or the family secrets may stop being family secrets. To be absolutely clear from the start, the £75 million demand has not been confirmed by Buckingham Palace or independently proven. Neither has the alleged threat to reveal royal secrets. Both claims come from unnamed sources quoted by magazines and newspapers. Andrew has not publicly confirmed them. The palace has not confirmed them. So this is not a story about a documented ransom note arriving at Buckingham Palace on a silver tray. It is a story about why such an outrageous claim sounds believable to so many people. Because by the time a rumour reaches £75 million, the interesting question is no longer just, is that exact number real? The interesting question is, what happened inside this family that made the number feel possible? This is the financial war between two brothers. One wears the crown. The other once appeared to believe the normal rules could not reach him. And somewhere between Royal Lodge, legal bills, private allowances, lost titles, and very expensive spiritual advice, their private feud became a public crisis. So put the kettle on. Make it strong. We are going inside a royal negotiation so uncomfortable that even the corgis would probably leave the room. For years, Andrew's position rested on three pillars: his birth, his mother's affection, and the institution's instinct to protect itself. He was not merely a wealthy man with a famous surname. He was the son of Queen Elizabeth II, the brother of the future king, and a former naval officer who had served during the Falklands War. He had a title, status, access, and a place in the royal machine. But the machine began rejecting him. His friendship with Jeffrey Epstein had already turned him into a global symbol of royal disgrace. Andrew has consistently denied wrongdoing connected to Epstein. He also settled the civil case brought by Virginia Giuffre without admitting liability. But public opinion was not waiting for a palace courtier to ring a bell and announce a verdict. The damage was already done. Then came the infamous BBC interview in 2019, intended as a rescue operation and remembered instead as the moment the lifeboat caught fire. The interview did not calm the scandal. It gave it new vocabulary. Pizza Express in Woking became part of royal folklore. The claim about not sweating became one of the strangest lines ever delivered in a serious television interview. Somewhere in Britain, a restaurant manager probably looked at the bookings and thought, well, publicity is publicity. Andrew stepped back from public duties. His honorary military roles and royal patronages went. His public appearances became fewer and more awkward. Yet one enormous symbol of privilege remained: Royal Lodge. Royal Lodge is not a lodge in the way most people understand the word. It is not a damp cabin where you discover the shower only works when nobody uses the toaster. It is a 30-room residence in Windsor Great Park, surrounded by extensive grounds, privacy, and the kind of history estate agents describe as character, because writing palace-adjacent mansion might seem a bit showy. Andrew had occupied the property under a long lease agreed with the Crown Estate. The arrangement became politically toxic when details of its terms received renewed attention. He had paid millions up front for refurbishment and other costs, but the continuing rent was reportedly the famous peppercorn arrangement, effectively nominal. For ordinary British renters, the phrase "one peppercorn" sounds less like a contract and more like an insult delivered by a Victorian ghost. While millions worried about mortgages, rents, and energy bills, the king's disgraced brother remained in a vast royal residence under a deal that appeared extraordinarily generous. Andrew's defenders pointed out that the lease had legal force and that he had invested substantial sums in the property. His critics saw an institution asking the public to admire its modern values, while one of its most controversial members sat behind 30 rooms and a very old contract. This was not simply a housing dispute. Royal Lodge had become Andrew's final fortress. Without public duties, military titles, or a serious route back into royal life, the house was the last visible evidence that he still belonged to the world he had lost. Remove the house, and the fall becomes physical. The demotion gets an address. King Charles had another problem. He had spent years promoting the idea of a slimmer monarchy, fewer working royals, clearer public value, and less obvious excess. Whatever one thinks of that project, leaving Andrew in Royal Lodge made the whole operation look like a pub's under new management sign, while the same sticky carpet remained inside. The tension dragged on. There were reports about security costs, maintenance bills, and alternative accommodation. There was speculation that Andrew might move to Frogmore Cottage. There were claims that Charles had reduced or ended a private allowance. Every few months, a headline announced a new ultimatum. Every few months, Royal Lodge remained exactly where it was, with Andrew apparently still inside. It became known in the media as the Siege of Royal Lodge. And in Britain, a siege can last a very long time, if both sides have tea, lawyers, and absolutely no intention of losing face. Then, in October 2025, the palace moved decisively. First, Andrew announced that he would no longer use his title or honours. Later that month, Buckingham Palace said the king had initiated a formal process to remove his style, titles, and honours. The palace stated that he would be known as Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, and that formal notice had been served for him to surrender the lease on Royal Lodge. This was not another carefully worded suggestion. It was an institutional removal. The man born a prince would no longer publicly be one. The Duke of York title, the style of Royal Highness, and his remaining honours were stripped away. The palace also made clear that its thoughts and sympathy remained with victims and survivors of abuse. For the monarchy, this was containment. For Andrew, it was the destruction of the last framework that had defined his adult life. The palace said he would move to private accommodation on the Sandringham estate, with arrangements privately funded by the king. That detail matters. Charles was not proposing to leave his brother on a park bench with a Sports Direct mug. Andrew would still have a home, privacy, security, and financial support beyond anything available to an ordinary person. But royal disputes are rarely about avoiding poverty. They are about hierarchy. A smaller house is still a smaller house when your family measures status in wings, gates, and whether the driveway has its own postcode. Soon, the alleged price of surrender appeared in the press. £75 million. The story claimed Andrew had told friends he wanted $75 million just to consider moving out. Think about the language there. Not necessarily to move, to consider moving. That is not a removal fee. That is a thought subscription. £75 million could buy hundreds of average British homes. It could fund thousands of annual state pensions. It could cover an almost heroic amount of council tax. And yet, in this reported negotiation, it was presented as the price of persuading one man to exchange one royal property for another. No verified public calculation explains why the figure would be £75 million. It could reflect the value Andrew placed on his lease and future security, or it could simply be a headline-friendly number attached to a messy negotiation. Royal reporting is a peculiar ecosystem. Sources brief journalists, friends brief magazines, and courtiers deny that anybody is briefing while briefing about the briefing. By lunchtime, a family argument can become constitutional thunder. But even if the exact figure was exaggerated, the underlying conflict was real. Andrew had a lease. The Crown wanted it surrendered. A long legal agreement cannot always be removed with a disappointed look from the monarch. Buckingham Palace itself acknowledged that the lease had given Andrew legal protection to remain. In other words, the king could remove a title more easily than a tenant. There is something almost perfectly British about that. Centuries of royal authority meet property law, and property law says, "Do you have that in writing?" Later scrutiny made the financial picture more complicated. Public spending watchdogs examined royal property deals, and reporting indicated that Andrew could have been entitled to compensation for ending the lease early. It also emerged that cottages connected with the estate had generated private rental income for him. That does not prove a £75 million demand. It does show that the dispute was not invented from thin air. There were real assets, real contractual rights, and real money involved. The alleged demands also went beyond one giant check. Reports described a wider package: appropriate staff in a new home, continuing support, protection for his status and financial security that would survive the eventual transition from Charles to William. The portrait was not of a man asking for emergency help. It was of a man trying to negotiate a permanent settlement. An allowance can be changed. A brother can be generous on Monday and furious by Thursday. A settlement, however, is designed to outlive moods, headlines, and reigns. According to the report, Andrew wanted guarantees that his life would not shrink again when Prince William became king. If true, that tells us where the deepest fear may have been. Charles may see a brother who has become impossible to defend, but impossible to abandon completely. William may see a continuing liability with a family connection attached. One approach says, "We must manage him." The other says, "Why is he still on the balance sheet?" That is why any alleged request for guarantees under a future King William would be more than financial planning. It would be an attempt to bind the next reign before it begins. Good luck getting that past the family group chat. Andrew also reportedly argued that the settlement should cover Sarah Ferguson and protect the interests of their daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie. Sarah and Andrew divorced in 1996, yet continued to maintain an unusually close relationship. They lived under the same roof at Royal Lodge for years. To outsiders, the arrangement often seemed less like a divorce and more like a very long British sitcom in which nobody can afford to end the tenancy. When Royal Lodge was taken away, Sarah lost her base there too. Beatrice and Eugenie are adults with families and careers of their own, and neither is a working royal. Reports, nevertheless, portrayed Andrew as defending the entire York branch of the family, claiming they were being deliberately erased or sidelined. This is where the financial argument becomes a story about identity. Andrew does not appear to see himself merely as an individual negotiating his own future. In the accounts attributed to people around him, he sees himself as the head of a branch of the House of Windsor. If he falls, the Yorks fall. If he is humiliated, they are humiliated. If he demands compensation, he can present it as protection for his family rather than payment for himself. It is a useful argument because it turns self-interest into fatherly duty. But it also raises an uncomfortable question. Were Sarah, Beatrice, and Eugenie actually asking him to fight this battle on their behalf? Or were their names being used to make his own demands sound less personal? There is no clear public evidence that his daughters endorsed a £75 million claim or any alleged threat. They should not be treated as parties to words they did not say. That is an important boundary, because royal feuds have a way of swallowing everybody standing nearby. Then we reach the darkest claim of all, the alleged threat to reveal royal secrets. One report, repeating claims attributed to unnamed insiders, suggested Andrew wanted Charles to fund his legal defense, and had hinted he could speak publicly about sensitive events inside royal circles if support was withheld. The article itself acknowledged that the claim had not been independently verified, and that Buckingham Palace had not commented. There is no recording in the public domain, no letter, no message, no named witness offering documentary proof. So we must not state as fact that Andrew blackmailed the king. But we can examine what the allegation means. Andrew has spent his entire life inside the monarchy. He has seen private conversations, family conflicts, and institutional decisions that the public may never hear about. He knows how the palace responds to scandal because, for years, he was one of the scandals it had to respond to. If any sidelined royal possesses potentially embarrassing knowledge, Andrew is an obvious candidate. The value of a secret depends not only on how shocking it is, but on who wants it kept quiet. Maybe there are no great secrets at all, only old arguments, unkind remarks, and the sort of behavior found in any family after Christmas lunch. The threat can still work, even if the box is empty. That is the logic of leverage. You do not have to show the cards if the other player is nervous enough about what they might be. And the monarchy is exceptionally vulnerable to that kind of pressure because its power depends on controlled visibility. The public sees ceremonies, uniforms, balconies, and carefully selected family photographs. Behind those images sits a private institution that survives partly by deciding what not to explain. Queen Elizabeth's famous approach was often summarized as, "Never complain, never explain." It worked best in an era when newspapers could be persuaded to keep certain matters quiet, and the public received royal news at breakfast, not through 10 million smartphones before the toast popped up. Today, "never explain" can look less like dignity and more like a buffering symbol. Charles cannot simply ignore every allegation involving Andrew because Andrew's history is connected to the palace's judgment. What did the institution know? When did it know it? Who paid for what? Who approved which arrangement? Why was action taken at one moment and not another? If Andrew ever gave a full, angry account of his life inside the firm, the danger might not be one spectacular revelation. It might be the accumulation of small decisions showing how royal protection operates. The palace's dilemma is brutal. Pay him, and it may look as though pressure works. Refuse him, and risk a public campaign by a man who believes he has nothing left to lose. Fight him legally, and turn a private family dispute into months of documents, hearings, and headlines. Support him quietly, and be accused of extending privilege to someone the institution publicly expelled. There is no clean option. There is only the least muddy field, and this is Britain, so it is probably raining. To understand how Andrew may have developed such extraordinary expectations, consider one smaller story: the £32,000 spiritual bill. Reports dating back several years claimed Andrew had used the services of an Indian spiritual healer, or guru, who would stay at Royal Lodge and provide treatment. The annual cost was said to be around £32,000. Queen Elizabeth had reportedly approved similar expenses in the past. Charles, according to the story, refused and told Andrew to pay for it himself. The claim became irresistible because of the contrast. £32,000 is tiny beside 75 million. But psychologically, it may tell us more. It suggests a world in which an adult man could present a 5-figure bill for personal spiritual treatment to the royal purse and expect somebody else to sign it. Most families argue over who ordered the extra naan. This family was allegedly discussing whether the king should finance a live-in guru. The treatment itself is not the joke. The absurdity lies in expecting its cost to travel upward to the monarch, as if Charles were not a brother, but an extremely ornate direct debit. For Andrew, the transition from Queen Elizabeth to King Charles was therefore more than a change of sovereign. It was the end of a personal financial culture. Elizabeth was his mother. By many accounts, she had a particularly soft spot for him. Charles was a brother, with his own plans for the monarchy and far less appetite for expensive indulgence. What Andrew may have experienced as cruel abandonment, Charles may have considered overdue boundaries. The same event can look very different from opposite ends of a palace corridor. To Andrew, "My family has turned against me." To Charles, "You are 66. Please pay your own guru." Then, in February 2026, the crisis escalated beyond money and property. Andrew was arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office over allegations connected to the sharing of confidential government material with Jeffrey Epstein. He was questioned and later released under investigation. Police searched properties connected to him, including his former residence at Royal Lodge. An arrest is not a conviction. Andrew has denied wrongdoing associated with Epstein, and the legal process must be allowed to proceed. But symbolically, the arrest was devastating. The royal system that once surrounded him could not prevent police officers from arriving at his home. The title was gone. Royal Lodge was gone. Now even the aura of untouchability was gone. King Charles issued a public statement expressing deep concern and making clear that the law must take its course. From an institutional perspective, it was the only credible response. A reigning monarch cannot appear to obstruct a police investigation into his brother. From a family perspective, however, the message was ice cold. Charles did not publicly offer brotherly comfort. He offered respect for due process. That may help explain why later reports described Andrew as bitter, furious, and convinced he had been made the family's fall guy. Again, those are claims from unnamed sources, not Andrew speaking on camera. But they fit a familiar pattern in his public story: a refusal to see consequences in the same way others see them. To the public, his downfall may look like the result of his own choices and associations. To Andrew, if the reports are accurate, it may look like selective punishment by an institution that benefited from silence and then abandoned him when he became too costly. That belief does not make him right, but it could make him dangerous to the palace. A man who accepts responsibility can be negotiated with. A man who believes he is the victim may treat every concession as too small and every boundary as an attack. Charles must protect the crown, provide some form of safety net for his brother, and avoid leaving William an unresolved crisis. He must do all this in a family where "we need to talk" probably arrives on embossed paper 3 weeks after the problem. Reports have suggested Charles is willing to provide Andrew with private financial support. That is very different from accepting a giant compensation demand or funding every legal and lifestyle cost. It is the middle path. Keep him housed, keep him stable, keep him away from public duties, and ideally, keep him quiet. But the middle path only works if Andrew accepts being in the middle. If he continues to believe he deserves the life of a senior royal, no allowance will feel like generosity. It will feel like an insult with monthly installments. And this is the wider issue for the monarchy. The scandal is not only about one difficult man. It is about the invisible system that creates expectations like his. Royal status is presented as service, sacrifice, and duty. Yet the institution also provides extraordinary homes, staff, security, prestige, and access. When a working royal stops working, what remains? Is the privilege conditional, or does birth create a permanent claim? Andrew's case forces the palace to answer that question in public. If the privileges continue, critics say there is no accountability. If the privileges disappear, Andrew can argue that royal family membership was always transactional. If the king pays privately, the taxpayer may not be directly responsible, but the public still sees wealth and power protecting their own. If the king refuses, the family conflict may spill into books, interviews, and leaks. The crown is caught between the damage of indulgence and the damage of exposure. That is why the alleged £75 million figure matters, even if it was never a formal demand. It has become a symbol of the price of unresolved privilege. For decades, the institution postponed the hardest questions. It managed the headlines. It adjusted the language. It removed duties before titles, titles before housing, and housing before financial support. Each step was careful, partial, and late. But delayed consequences collect interest. By the time Charles acted decisively, Andrew had years to think of Royal Lodge not as temporary royal support, but as his right. Removing it could never feel to him like a reasonable correction. It would feel like confiscation. And when entitlement meets humiliation, negotiation becomes revenge. That may be the real story behind all the unnamed quotes about anger, secrets, and money. Not a single dramatic ultimatum, but an escalating struggle over who gets to define Andrew's fall. Charles wants it defined as accountability, titles removed, residence surrendered, private support arranged, law respected. Andrew, according to the reports, wants it defined as betrayal, a loyal family member discarded, his branch of the family humiliated, and his past service forgotten. The public may define it more simply: a privileged man finally encountering the word no. £75 million to consider moving, staff in the new residence, support for Sarah, protection for the York family, guarantees after William becomes king, legal bills covered. None of those claims has been fully documented, and some may be exaggerated. Together, however, they describe an attitude. Andrew does not believe he should simply disappear. He wants terms. And perhaps that is the most royal detail of all. Even exile requires a negotiation. What happens next depends on the legal investigation, Charles's patience, and Prince William. If the case develops, financial disputes may become secondary to a far more serious battle. If it does not, Andrew may feel vindicated and become more willing to challenge the palace. Charles has shown that he will take dramatic action when institutional pressure becomes unbearable, while still providing a private safety net. He appears to want Andrew removed from royal life, not destroyed. William's future monarchy is expected to be even leaner and less tolerant of reputational risk. If Andrew's settlement relies on Charles's personal support rather than a binding arrangement, the next reign could bring another round of cuts. Andrew knows that. Charles knows that. William certainly knows that. So the clock is not only counting down on a family argument, it is counting down on a reign. The alleged demand for future guarantees is an attempt to stop that clock. But no king can fully control the next king. That is the problem with hereditary power. Even the succession plan has a succession plan. There is also a larger public question. How much should the monarchy pay for silence? Not necessarily literal silence purchased through a secret deal. Silence can be maintained through housing, allowances, security, and access. It can be encouraged by preserving dignity. It can be protected by ensuring that a disgruntled relative never feels desperate enough to publish everything. Every powerful family manages difficult members. The difference is that most families do not sit at the center of the British Constitution. If Charles funds Andrew, he may be protecting a brother. He may also be protecting the crown. Those motives are almost impossible to separate. And if the alleged threat to reveal secrets is false, the palace still faces the damage caused by the rumour. Millions now believe Andrew possesses information the monarchy fears. Denying it could give the story more oxygen. Ignoring it allows suspicion to grow. It is the perfect royal trap. Explain, and you feed the scandal. Refuse to explain, and people assume the worst. Never complain, never explain has become never win. Perhaps there is no explosive archive. Perhaps the palace's deepest secrets are merely petty, human, and disappointing. Who complained? Who approved an allowance? Who wanted Andrew removed? And who protected him longer? Institutions are often damaged less by one cinematic revelation than by proof of ordinary hypocrisy. The monarchy says duty comes first. Andrew's story asks whether family came first until the headlines became too ugly. The monarchy says no one is above the law. His long protection led many people to wonder when that principle began. The monarchy says royal privilege supports public service. Royal Lodge raised the question of what happens when the service ends, but the privilege stays. That is why this feud reaches beyond gossip. It is a stress test for the whole royal model. Can the institution discipline one of its own without paying him an enormous price? Can it support a family member without appearing to protect him from consequences? Can it ask the public to believe in transparency while its most important conversations remain hidden behind palace walls? And can Charles end this crisis before William inherits it? We may never know whether Andrew truly said the words £75 million. We may never hear a direct threat to expose royal secrets. Anonymous reports are not proof, and responsible viewers should treat them with caution. But we do know this. Andrew had a valuable legal interest in Royal Lodge. He resisted pressure to leave for years. The king removed his titles and arranged a move. Andrew's future lifestyle depends heavily on private royal support, and the relationship between the brothers has become inseparable from the monarchy's greatest modern scandal. Those are not rumours. They are the architecture that makes the rumours powerful. Maybe the 75 million is fantasy. Maybe it is an opening bid. Maybe it is the emotional value Andrew placed on the last symbol of who he used to be. Or maybe it is simply the estimated cost of keeping one very angry former prince from reaching for a microphone. Whatever the truth, the crown now faces a problem money cannot fully solve. Pay too much, and Andrew learns that pressure works. Pay too little, and he may decide he has nothing left to protect. Cut him off, and the family feud could become a public spectacle. Keep supporting him, and the monarchy remains tied to the man it tried to remove. The king may control the castles, titles, and allowances, but Andrew may still control the one thing the palace has always valued most: his own silence. So where is the limit? How much would Charles be willing to provide to keep the conflict private? How much would Andrew accept to live quietly? And if a royal secret only stays secret because somebody's bills are paid, was it ever secure in the first place? Tell me what you think. Is the alleged £75 million demand a believable sign of royal entitlement, or a tabloid number inflated for maximum outrage? Is Charles being too soft on his brother, or is private support the least damaging option available? And if Andrew ever told his full story, would it shake the monarchy, or merely confirm what the public already suspects? One thing is certain. This is no longer just a row over a house. It is a battle over money, memory, loyalty, and the price of belonging to the most famous family in Britain. The Crown wanted Andrew out of Royal Lodge. The real question is whether it can ever get out of Andrew's shadow.